nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
I just have to remind you, don't you ever let anybody take your power from you. You have the same power that you did before November 5th. And you have the same purpose that you did. And you have the same ability to engage and inspire. So don't ever let anybody or any circumstance take your power from you.
I just have to
Welcome
remind
to the
you
Black
that
Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I hope y'all were inspired with that opening. You know, maybe you should go grab a drink like she did, clearly. And but anyway,
we being petty today.
we're gonna talk about power today. So I just thought, we should take somebody who, is clearly a very inspirational figure to all of our listeners.
We starting off early today. All right, let's go.
All right. So again, welcome to Black Men's Podcast. It's your host, Too Black. I'm here with Ryan today. What's good, Ryan? It's been a while.
Man, it's been a minute. I'm glad to be back. I went through some personal trials and tribulations, but I'm in good spirits. I'm happy to be back. It's been a while, and I don't want to stay away that long. Just want to jump back into things.
I feel that. Yeah, welcome back. We do not have our full cast today, but as we were saying off air, I think this will be the first episode where we don't have the full cast, but we're gonna do a breakdown of our own. There is no guests or anything today, but I'm fully confident we'll get that done. I do want to say,
interviews.
No interviews or anything. I do want to say, she's not here, but Cam has a baby on the way now. So Terrell's just had his back in what was it, September, and now Cam has a baby on the way. I don't know precisely when it's due, but so we've added new people to the family here. We'll be adding another new person to the family. So congratulations to her and her husband. Got married and got pregnant in the same year. So we'll have a baby by next year. So shout out to her. Today's myth is this nebulous myth to an extent that is easier to organize under Democrats. We will come back to that, but I want to get this out of the way because sometimes I feel like I name the people late. I want to shout out our patrons who have signed up over the last month. So we got Cambridge, Giles, David Bowling, Rowan Newbie, Marxist Mariner, I am clear as Ud, Francisca Larkin, and David Crockett have signed up over since we've been on. Since the last time we was on, so shout out to them. Thank you, everyone. This definitely helps sustain the show, so definitely want to shout out everybody.
Yeah, big shout out to all our patrons. We appreciate the support, and we will continue to give you quality content.
And speaking of Patreon, we started this thing. Me and Ryan did it. Me and Ryan launched the first one where we do what's called a pre-production meeting, kind of like reflection. It's a much more loose-based type of episode than what we do on our full episodes. So we talk about the myth, kind of like what we're thinking, where our head is, and kind of just brainstorm out loud. There's not a lot of hard data or anything offered, but I thought it was actually pretty good. And I know it was helpful to developing today's episode for me. So if you want to check that out,
it's just really just us bouncing ideas off each other. This is in the very beginning of the development of this episode, and just us working through some ideas, working through some concepts, riffing, going on tangents, as we usually do on our regular episodes. So if you guys want to just hear us brainstorm, just go ahead and check that out.
Yeah, I mean, it's like don't really do a lot of extra content for Patreon. Sometimes I don't even post the episode itself. But so so if y'all want to see more, it's easy lifting because it doesn't require any extra work. It's just literally getting on and talking about where we're at with the myth before it's like fully vetted and finalized because we do have to go through a process. We don't just say let's do a myth and then we just show up. Like that's not how it works. Like there's research, there's
No.
a way to frame
Mm-mm.
things. So for people who enjoy this show, it's part of what makes it, I think, a good show is because we put a lot of work into making sure we frame things properly. We do our research. And,
Yes.
especially when the full crew's here, we still have fun, we still joke, but we're able to
Mm.
talk through it because we know what we're talking about. And that allows us to have fun and still stay on topic most of the time. So it's
Most
like,
of the time,
uh,
whenever we can, we make a
yeah.
valiant effort. But you know,
So if
so many
you
people, so many ideas, so many words just thrown around. My
So
bad. Go ahead, Black.
like normally we do like at every episode we do a short reflection of what we thought about the myth anyway. This would be probably more these will be more extended types versions of that. And us also just thinking about different ways to attack it. So that'll be on Patreon. You might hear if you already heard that, you might hear similar stuff we talked about on there today, but this will be more refined. So with that being said, again, today's myth is um it is easier to organize under Democrats. Just so people have some sense, the myth means basically that it's easier to politically organize under Democrats, and it's we'll get to a kind of souped up lesser evil argument. I'll say more later, but that's the baseline of the myth. And today we're going to demonstrate that there's really nothing that bears that out as a general rule. It might be
Mm.
maybe specific, but we'll get to that. But go ahead,
No,
Ryan, as far as
no.
what you thought about it.
Well, when I initially heard the myth and we were going back for talking about this, I thought it was a great idea because I've heard this sentiment echoed by a couple of my liberal friends, even some family members, because there's a presupposed idea that Democrats, since they're more left of the Republican Party, but that's not saying much, that we will be able to make progress under them more than a Republican. But as you'll see in this episode, that is not true whatsoever. And one thing I want people to realize with this episode, we're focusing on the word easier and what does that mean in the context of the given duopoly we live under, right? So it's is it easier to organize in a Democratic administration? No, I think we would try to argue that maybe it's different. I mean, since both political parties are an intrinsic part of this empire, they're not going to do anything to cause the demise of this empire. Um, and there's a Black Alliance for Peace article that says focusing only one part of the duopoly is akin to focusing only one faction of the capitalist class. Therefore, we can't just focus on the Republican Party or this incoming Republican administration. Got to keep our eyes on Democrats as well because they are complicit in our oppression. So, and we'll explain this further in the episode as it goes on.
That was a good explanation, yeah. And I think for me, again, I admittedly, and as I said this in our pre-production episode, I'm not as hard I'm not as
Mhm.
hard line against these kind of arguments as some people. I don't agree, obviously, or I wouldn't be doing this episode, but I'm not I sometimes can be a little bit too much of a realist sometimes. So so I think so dealing with
I get it.
conditions as they are and trying to figure out what's the best route forward and recognize you have imperfect selections or choices, that's not something I'm necessarily always opposed to. But I don't think that's really what this is getting at. That's my issue with this when people make this claim. Is
Mm-hmm.
that it's not just about figuring out like, okay, we have imperfect choices, so let's just pick this thing and just continue our work like people like to say rhetorically. It doesn't really hold up. Um, so I've wanted to write a piece all year about lesser evilism, and I was going through our Rolodex of episodes back in February. Did a episode with Dr. James. It was called the myth was lesser evil with the question mark. And we dealt
Mm.
more with that as a case study in terms of Erica Gardner and what she was dealing with in the book New Bones Abolition. This is a broader way of approaching it in terms of, and this is a little bit different than just the lesser evil because people are trying to make that a more sophisticated argument by using these other terms like it's easier to organize, we have to pick our opponent and all that, right? So I want to give people some context as to where we are gathering this from. This isn't just something we hear around the way. So this kind of popped off online and in some organizing spaces back in I think this article came out back in September. It was an article called Angela Davis electing Harris will open space for more radical struggles. That was the case that was being made. And they quote some of the things she said. And she talks about different things. She talked about Obama, and she says when Obama was elected, that was a very important victory, Davis said, when asked about the
Mm.
advance of black political figures in the U.S. Quote, it was not a victory in relation to what he actually accomplished. But okay, that kind of all right. What he actually accomplished during his presidency, but rather what was significant was that young people organized and accomplished something that was considered to be impossible. So she's saying that people didn't think you could elect a black person to be president, and people should be cheerful that they were able to prove that you can. But even though the
It's
victory was the significant
wild.
victory was not related to what he actually did in office.
That
So
is wild to
I'll
even
let y'all
admit
sit
that.
with that. I'm just contextualizing it.
It's- he didn't really accomplish much, but at least he got in there.
And
Like
the
nigga, you
people
get a
again
participation trophy, but
to
essentially.
try to be partial to so people understand the logic is
Okay.
to say it was a victory because people won something, and sometimes in organizing victories matter even if it's not the ultimate victory. I think that's
Mm.
what she's attempting to say. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but that's how I read that at least.
Okay.
But again, I'll let people sit with that. Um, you know, and then the line
That's
that
very
kind of
fair.
gets, yeah, the line that kind of gets her to that brings that started prompting these easier to organize on the Democrats. And it's also important to know that Angela Davis has been making a very similar argument since Obama was in office, made it in 2020, made it with Hillary. I mean, she's been making this argument for over 10 years now that I'm aware of, and probably longer. But as far as like, there's usually every election cycle, there's an article or an interview she does and she makes a very similar case almost every time.
Mhm.
So in this case, talking about Kamala, she says it's not just about electing Kamala Harris, it's about opening space. They said, quote, those of us who are more radical than Kamala Harris to put an anti-capitalist, anti-racist program forward and increase the pressure for change, quote, especially in the first place when it comes to genocide being inflicted on the people of Palestine. So then
Okay.
she goes on to say, no question about who progressive people and people who identify with radical change will vote for. So this was an event that she was at in France, I believe.
Mm.
Um, and she was speaking at it's a festival. I can't speak French, so I'm gonna probably butcher this, but it's El Humante or Humanites. Again, I can't speak French, so I don't know what it actually says. But it was an event. Um, but I think it was the newspaper of the French Communist Party so
Okay.
the French Communist Party that hosted it, and she was speaking, and this is what was transcribed and came back, So again, we're not here to get into an Angela Davis criticism. We've clearly done enough of that. So we're
Please
not
go check out our Angela Davis episodes
yeah,
for
we're
further,
yeah,
for
we're not
further reference.
we're not trying to go down that
Uh,
road. And I
so
think we were gracious even when we did that, but it's just to say that, when Angela Davis says something, this sentiment gets echoed and then people start using it as a way to push their kind of line of how they think we should engage electoral politics. Well, then this
mm,
whole it's easier to organize than the Democrats became an argument. And it was interesting how these arguments kept springing up. So when Biden
yeah.
was in office, people seemed like they were out. and then Kamala gets in, and then all these there was the progressive case for Kamala written by Mehdi Hassan and all these different folks trying to make a case for Kamala, and it ultimately was this kind of like lesser evil but more sophisticated version of well, you have to it's easier to organize under these individuals. So even though, yes, they're committing genocide, yes, they're doing this, it's easier to organize. So
Mm-hmm.
versus with Trump, they're going to shut down all avenues. It's easier to organize under Democrats. And that's a sentiment that isn't just applied to this election, but it gets applied, like I've said in the past,
Mm-hmm.
consistently by these kind of more celebrity, radicals, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and it's
You know.
interesting that yep, that's exactly what I was about to bring up because somebody with that's Angela Davis with so much clout, and she is essentially the face in the mainstream of what it means to be a black radical.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I mean, and when she makes statements like this, these lesser evil arguments, it's disparaging, and I feel like it just gives the green light for a lot of people, especially liberals, to hop on that train and push that sentiment further into the forefront. And then next thing it's just a wildfire. So our
Yeah.
job here on the Black Mist podcast is to cut through all that bullshit.
Yeah, yeah. And it's like I remember in 2020 there was a whole thing again. I hate referencing Twitter because I think life should exist much further beyond Twitter, but there was
Of course.
this did pop off on Twitter, and there was this whole thing like, well, if Angela Davis says, well, for Biden, then I don't you can't, because it was basically like you can't get more
Exactly.
radical than her. So, and it was just, and I had a white
Exactly.
and I had a white dude say this
Exactly.
to me, and I was like, bro, you don't even get to have this conversation. Like, don't
No.
like you're not even,
No.
I was like,
Nah.
and
Your arms are
you
too
know.
short to box with God. Like,
Yeah,
stay
like
over there,
you're
bro.
not even involved here, bro. Like, this isn't even, you don't get to come up and, but that's the thing. And I don't even know if she or others realize when they make statements, people will use this to push their line. So there was another video.
I would disagree. I think she knows. She's been doing this for
Hey,
years. I think she knows.
I can't, I try to I don't know what people's intentions are, but I'm not going to
Okay,
argue with you.
fair. That's
So
fair.
there was another video that came, or another thing that came out from it got a lot of circulation. I really admittedly wasn't that aware of this group. And it was this video called Vote Like a Radical by the Indian Collective. And again, I'm gonna say that slow. Indian Collective. It's a play on Indian. It's a
Mhm.
indigenous based group. They led it, but there was other people in it, like Bill Fletcher and such. Um, and it was like vote like a radical. I'm gonna play a very short portion of this, and then we'll move on, thankfully.
You might be a radical, but if you're like most of us, you never learned how to vote like a radical.
Radicals remember three things.
1, all candidates, once elected, become our opponents.
2, we vote for the ones we're best suited to fight.
3, we protect movements, our real source of power.
If you went to school in the United States, you likely heard
that a vote meant something special, expressed who we are,
told the world what we stood for.
Now, some of us have always known.
Black folks have always said it.
And indigenous peoples of this land have always said that this system is unequal at its core.
But whenever you realize it, the day you see that our system doesn't work because it can't work, is the day your life begins to be a radical life.
Yet it's easy to skip a step. Every 4 years, we can fall into voting in a liberal way.
Like we're co-signing a candidate rather than picking our opponent.
But for radicals, voting isn't personal.
Because radicals know all presidents, once elected, become our opponents.
In a year like this, where we're so full of grief and rage at the genocide in Gaza and an unjust wider war that seems like it's just beginning,
it can feel like casting a vote condones these horrific injustices.
The idea of voting like a radical, that video, it just feels like it's just voicing, and much respect to our indigenous loved ones out there, our comrades, but like it just feels like it's reinforcing and echoing the same sentiments that Angela Davis is echoing, that a lot of other liberals have echoed. It feels disingenuous to even put a video like that together and then broadcast it as if to say like, one, I feel like radicals we've kind of explored that voting. A lot of us, explore that voting sentiment, the idea. I mean, how you become a radical revolutionary when all other possibilities are exhausted is that it's just to say like if radicals already don't know how to vote or know how the electoral process works, it's interesting to say like you're a radical but you don't vote like one. I'm like, okay, all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Also, it's just like people don't want to hear this on really any side, but there really isn't
Mm,
a criteria for voting. Like you can
yeah.
say there's one, but I'm just saying like there's not a rubric that you have to fill out when you vote. Like it really is however people choose to do it. That you can criticize it for what it is. So everybody creates these I guess ways of how we should vote. Like there's some holy grail written down somewhere about how
Mm,
voting works. So it's just like
right.
voting
Like
doesn't have, yeah,
there's a whole checklist or standards that you have to abide by in order to become a radical
yeah,
through a voting process that is inherently linked to the system that you're trying to overthrow. Okay, sure,
yeah. I
whatever.
don't, yeah, yeah. So it's like the whole pick your opponent or whatever.
Yeah.
Again, I can hear the argument. I get what they're saying.
Hmm.
It's just what was weird about these things is where this one popped up pretty late in the game too.
Hmm.
It was almost like a last ditch effort as it was pretty evident that Kamala Harris was going to lose to people. I actually didn't even think she was.
It
I
reeks
thought
of
she,
desperation. You're right.
yeah.
It does. It does.
Um, but as I said in our pre-production episode, this is a very simple thing for me. If it's easier to organize under Democrats, then your candidate should have won. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not
Point
really,
blank. Period.
it's not, like
If it
you
was
should have.
easier to organize underneath a Democratic administration, which we already are under, then you should have won.
Yeah, like people, these things can be tested. Like you can't just make statements. So if it's easier to organize, then why did you just lose to a fascist? It doesn't. Maybe it's not easier when that's your candidate, when the party continues to piss off its base, when it offers diet genocide or whatever. Like maybe that's not easier to organize under because it does not really galvanize people in the way that you, as a so-called radical, wants it to. So
Hmm.
the argument doesn't really hold up there. We're going to get into history and what is organizing and all of that, but I'm just saying, like, if it was easier, then you should be able to demonstrate that in the election. Like it's not you shouldn't lose the Senate and the presidency and the House. I mean, the Republicans already had the House, but now you've given away all three. You can't get wiped out like that and then say it's easier to organize. Because one of the
And then,
easiest things to organize is an election because you have way more resources than most organizers have for more local based things. So a national
resources,
election,
more eyes on you
yeah,
because people are focusing on the national election. And then, it's interesting. It's interesting to see how this whole thought process transpires. And plus, when the Democrats pulled out all the stops, like you're gonna make all the calls, all those little celebrities, all those speeches,
pay the
all
celebrities, pay the celebrities,
commercials,
yeah.
and you couldn't pull out a win. You did
No.
every yeah.
So yeah, and so yeah, just so we're gonna get further into it, but I do want to clarify one last thing before we get to the monologue and get to the kind of meat of the conversation. We're not saying on the opposite end that it's easier to organize under Republicans. That's not the
That
case
part.
we're making. So
That part.
for anybody that's watching or listening, that's not the case. So what y'all
Mhm.
Trump supporters like, I mean
Nah.
that's not really worth intellectually engaging. But I just want to be clear that's not what we're not saying that. Where if anything, there's not an inherent upside to just organizing under a party if you cannot set those conditions. Just voting for the party and hoping that they hand you better conditions is poor strategy anyway. I think Ryan said you said it earlier, and you also said it in our pre-episode. not saying it's better. Things are different under different administrations. But even if you say, okay, Trump's about to do all this crazy shit and he's got this crazy
Yeah.
cabinet, you can't look at that in a silo and not think about how the other parts of the world have played into Trump feeling like he has this mandate. A lot of that is
Hmm.
due to the failure of the Democratic Party.
Hmm.
That is also just due to the effect of late stage capitalism and imperialism, and there's all these different factors that can explain why a party gets in office, and it can't just be limited to just looking at the party. You have to look at the entire state. You have to look at the entire way of operation of things. Um,
Hmm.
so, we reject just the whole framing of or easier to organize because it assumes that organizing is dictated by the party in office and not organizing dictating the party or not organizing dictating the conditions. It's that the conditions are dictated by the party. So you organize for a party that then hands you more favorable conditions. That's how that argument comes off. So that's a losing argument anyway. And if you're focusing on electoral politics to dictate organizing, then again, you're not winning. So
Yeah, it's a
as
losing
we just
strategy.
yeah, we just watched it. So that's that. Just to kind of flesh out what we mean, what the myth means. So I'm gonna read a quick monologue, and then we're gonna get into the question that we didn't address at all, really, or not at all, but not much on our pre-episode. Like, what is organizing? Because that word gets thrown around, and it's just kind of like, what does that even mean, right? So we're gonna get into some of
Hmm.
that. So I'll read this monologue real quick, and then we'll get to it. Capitalism consistently offers us evils we are forced to navigate. The mother who chooses to go hungry so her child has enough crumbs to at least eat something for the day. The father who only has enough money to pay one bill, yet is stuck between repo or no heat for the month. The rape victim who must decide if she will keep a child she is forced to carry or live with the guilt of aborting the memory of her assailant. None of these evil conditions are ideal, but decisions for survival must be made regardless. If you overextend this logic, it would assume that a similar approach could be applied to voting. Yes, one candidate may support genocide, but the other one supports genocide more, whatever that means. And they might even strip away your hard-earned rights. Thus, I should vote for the lesser genocider who is theoretically going to still uphold my rights, right? Now, generally, I'm not one who judges people for what they do to survive, as we all have done things that we're not proud of to survive. What concerns me is how decisions that are meant to navigate evil can evolve to crystallize evil. The stresses of capitalism and imperialism all but force us to rationalize evil conditions. Thus, we rationalize poverty, we rationalize
Yep.
rape, we rationalize
Yep.
genocide, and after a certain point, lesser evil is no longer about survival. Instead, it becomes a way of life. It becomes a philosophy. Lesser evilism as a philosophy destroys human dignity. It crushes our imagination for better. It pits us against each other in a scramble to fight for the crumbs left over by evil. It teaches us to organize for these crumbs, but delusionally calls said crumbs, quote unquote, power, so we can tell ourselves that one day we will confront the evil that scares us. You know the phrases. We're going to hold them accountable. We're going to get them in office and hold their feet to the fire. We're going to push them to the left. We're going to pick our opponents. We're going to take out the trash. Meanwhile, evil gets even more comfortable. It smugly kicks its feet up on our tables as we hurl empty slogans at it, unbothered as it keeps poisoning our water, murdering our children, heating up our planet, stealing our land, imprisoning our heroes. But we still think that this is negotiable. If this election proved anything, it's that evil must be defeated, not negotiated with. Because voting for easier evil conditions to organize under don't mean shit to people who want those evil conditions to change. Lesser evil as a philosophy doesn't transform conditions, it adapts us to them, then calls the adaptation organizing. We deserve better. We deserve it all. All right.
Amen. Couldn't have said it better. We do deserve better. And that's one thing we got a purpose in our mind when we're radicals. We have to know that we deserve better as a people. We don't have to be subjected to these conditions. And if we're going to, I mean, like Black said with this whole episode, easier to organize than the Democratic Party. Um, we don't have to think beyond those confines, those constructs and everything, and know that to truly change your conditions, you have to be able to organize. You have to be able to mobilize the people. You have to be able to offer people alternatives and offer people a feeling of hope where they can obtain dignity,
Yeah.
outside of just electoral politics, because that's not where our politics and our work stops, especially if you're a grassroots organizer. You have to touch the people. You have to be out there on the ground. It also kind of reminds me of when Kwame Ture talked about the idea of nonviolence, the difference between using it as a tactic and a strategy. And it's the same way that I think if anybody looked at Black and I's pre-recording episode, we talked about people who adopt lesser than evil as a philosophy through how they move around the world. And that's a losing strategy. That's a losing philosophy, a losing strategy.
Yeah.
Like, because lesser evil, you're still voting for evil. And like he said in the monologue, a less genocidal president, you know what I mean? Like, genocide shouldn't happen in the first place, period. But as we get on going through this episode, we're going to slowly go through all of these points throughout history on why it's not easier to organize underneath a Democratic administration. It's just different. That's it.
Yeah, and again, we talked about lesser evil as a philosophy versus a tactic, and what I was getting at is how conditions can, because I'm still trying to think materially here, so conditions can move people from just doing what they have to do to survive to that becoming the way they think the world should work. Right. So I think there was a time where maybe you did vote tactically for the lesser quote unquote evil. But no more can you tell me that's a tactic, because we do this every 4 years. So it's become a philosophy. It's a philosophy to do lesser evilism, and the whole entire organizing, nonprofit model at least evolves around the lesser evilism over and over and over again. You talk radical for 3 years, and then you get in line that last year and you push this weaker candidate or whatever, and you hope that you can continue your work and pick your opponent or whatever. So it's not a tactic anymore. It's an entire philosophy, and as we'll go through historically, you can see how that as a philosophy actually closes the doors on you, and the conditions that you want to organize under become worse.
Crazy. Yeah,
because
it's like you're essentially going around in a circle. You keep doing lesser evil. Nothing is going to change. You keep choosing for the lesser evil.
Yeah, so people that want to say it's a tactic, there's no evidence of it. It's become a philosophy because we can actually see that this is how we have this conversation every time. So if it was
you said in our pre-episode, tactics change and evolve given your current situation, conditions in which you're battling. If you were adopting this lesser evil as a tactic and then it doesn't work, then you stop using the tactic.
Yeah.
And once you keep doing it over and over and over again, it is a philosophy.
Yeah.
It's insanity. You keep doing the same thing, thinking you're going to get a different outcome.
Yeah, it's a way of life at this point. And I would even argue part of the philosophy is saying it's a tactic or picking your opponent. Part of the philosophy is jazzing it up to not be honest about what it really is. That's one of the components and facets of the philosophy. All right. So the question then becomes, what is organizing? Because again, this term gets thrown around a lot within these left spaces. Most people are not doing much of it, but it is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it's sometimes I think has even a almost godlike mysteriousness and quality to how we think about it. It's like, it's the Jedi Knight kind of thing or something. If you're an organizer, and I think we need to kind of demystify it. So when we walk into history, people have a better understanding of what we're even getting at. So I'm going to play this, and I'm sure many of you listening or watching have heard this. If not, this is a great clip. Play this, Kwame Ture, talking about the difference between mobilizing and organizing.
We say that we must come to know the difference between mobilization and organization because the enemy will use mobilization to demobilize us. Mobilization is very easy, very, very easy. Because since we're people who are instinctively ready to respond against acts of injustice, anytime there's one little act of injustice, we can blow it up and we'll find people who come and make some mass demonstration around it. Miss Sally lost her job. Let's rally. She'll get her job back. People will come and rally. So-and-so got kicked out of school because the teacher's unjust. The people will come and rally. They will come to rally at issues. And this is what mobilization does. It mobilizes people around issues. Those of us who are revolutionary are not concerned with issues. We're concerned with the system. The difference must be properly understood. The difference must be properly understood. Mobilization usually leads to reform action, not to revolutionary action. If we would look scientifically at the October 16th million and more march, we would see clearly that this was a mobilized event, not an organized event. We must know clearly the difference between mobilization and organization. One of the characteristics of mobilization is that it is temporary. Organization is permanent and eternal. Clear differences must be made because the unconscious can usually be captured easily around one-issue items, around mobilization items, but it's hard to catch them around organization. But these unconscious must be brought to organization. We must transform mobilization to organization. We say the enemy will come and use mobilization to demobilize us. Many brothers and sisters who've been to the million and more march will say to you, I was there. Well, what are you doing today, my sister? I was there. There weren't too many sisters out there, but you know, with a million brothers together, you know where I had to be. I was there. Yes. And then, of course, you find brothers, yeah, I was there. I helped you. What are you doing today, brother? If we're not careful, we allow mobilization to become events. The struggle is never an event. It's a process, a continual, eternal process.
The way he just broke that down, tens across the board, like, because that's essentially what happens all the time. They'll do everything to mobilize people in a way that's going to demobilize radical efforts. The whole idea of even coming up with the lesser evil or voting lesser evil or using voting, that's supposed to have been a tactic. People watch our episode on voting, but made it into a whole main thing that people have to think about every 4 years. And then just the fact that they push these narratives, like we just saw in that video, the Indian video, in order to vote like a radical, that means you have to vote for the lesser two evils, which would be the Democratic Party that you're going to face, even though it's still tied to a system that you're trying to overthrow. It is all just it's a cycle. It's always a cycle. And the way that Kwame Ture broke that down so so eloquently, because once you're organized, once you actually have everything set in place, you think through a problem. You think through how you're going to mobilize people against the mobilization that's used to immobilize radical movements, to think through these things, to make sure that the people know that the struggle continues and you got to put in forth the effort, put in the work. It puts everything in perspective, so much in perspective. Excuse me if I'm just rambling. My bad, man.
No, it's cool. I mean, yeah, I think I think that distinction is important to first kind of cut into it because people will think you're doing, if you have a big crowd, that's inherently organizing. It could be if you investigate and see that, but if it's just a matter of, like we look at 2020, it was a lot of mobilizing going on. So there's a lot of people that mobilized to the streets. But how many of those people joined anything? How many of those people formed anything? how many of those people stuck to anything, versus just can say, like he said in the video, I was there. And 2020 becomes this moment that you remember. I was there. I was out in the streets. I was the. But what did that necessarily lead to? If anything, 2020, led to a really major blowback. And I would argue part of it was because folks did not consolidate any of the energy on the streets. I won't say any of it, but not enough of that energy was consolidated into anything that could stand up against quote unquote fascism or whatever words people want to throw around. So now everybody's vulnerable, when had that energy been transformed beyond just saying I was outside and, free this or like send this cop to jail like that or prison. That was the extent of it. And he talks earlier in that clip about how Martin Luther King was not an organizer. He said he was a mobilizer. Martin Luther King brought people to a site. He, they would have their demands and such, and he was a great mobilizer. But nothing really was built after he left. He might have knocked down laws or something, but there was nothing inherently built. First, the SNCC was often who he was a part of, was often living with people in the quarters of Black folks, working with them every day, learning their ways and figuring out bigger strategies. So it wasn't just a matter of, okay, we're going to bring Dr. King here. Like they're the ones who knew all the folks in the community that even allowed for mobilizing to occur. Mobilizing isn't a bad thing. It's just not, it's not the same thing. So voting in and of itself within an election, national election, if that's all you're doing, that's just mobilizing anyway. If all you're doing is just trying to drag people to vote. A political party is supposed to actually do more than just put candidates in office, something else people don't really think about. So the fact the Democratic Party is not even really a serious Democratic or a serious political party, because what else does it do besides run candidates? A political party can offer mutual aid. It can offer political education. It becomes an organization that has a base, that's a force to get things done. The Democratic Party basically outsources all of the organizing to these other organizations through nonprofits and such that are then stuck in that funding cycle. Yes. And have to kind of do it just to stay within, in many cases, not all organizations, but a lot of nonprofits have to do this. The ones that work in the political arena have to mobilize voters for the party to keep getting their funding. Like that's a way they kind of clawed in.
Yeah, and what you say, your book, they're laundering that whole process, right? Yeah. They're mobilizing people to channeling all that anger into fronts that they've set up. We don't have to go through them all, but like DEI and stuff like that. And even if we can piggyback off of going back to Kwame Ture, he always knew how to offer a sobering perspective on the world. Like he once said in the Pitfalls of Liberalism that the liberal represents the liaison between both the oppressed and the oppressor. The liberal tries to be the arbitrator, but he's incapable of solving problems. He promises the oppressor that the oppressed will be under control, and at the same time, he promised the oppressed that he'd be able to alleviate their suffering in due time. That's how it ends. So Kwame Ture even knew that the Democratic Party didn't have our best interests at heart. This was something that he wholeheartedly believed. So,
yeah. And I wrote out a definition because there's another thing. There's not a lot of for all the ways that the term gets thrown around, at least from what I could find, there's not a lot of what I found to be clear definitions of organizing. Like it's kind of there are some out there. I try to synthesize the ones that I read. This one is not perfect, so we're also gonna get into an article that or it was originally a speech that Kamal Franklin of Community Movement Builders, and also one of our BLM, formerly BPM, I guess colleagues or comrades. But the definition I wrote out was building with oppressed people towards a position of collective political power that governs over the matters impacting our day-to-day lives. This includes health, food, safety, housing, labor, education, media, and recreation. So and most of the time we don't have any control over these things. For instance, when prices go up, we don't have enough power to make them go down. We have no control over prices, right? If whether that's prices for food, whether that's prices for medicine, most of us have no control whatsoever over the prices. And that's because the side that sets those prices is organized. They have the means of production locked down. They can raise those prices. You're not organized. You're a consumer, and you're taught to think about your own personal self-interest and not the interests of others. And therefore, you can't really do much, to deal with high prices. If you have to eat, they control, again, the means of production where the things that actually govern your day-to-day life can't, if you don't have an organized way to boycott that or to go on strike, you kind of have to pay those prices, or you have to, or you have to go to other means, individually stealing or whatever. Right. And that goes for education, media. These are not things like if we got kicked off YouTube today, we're not organized enough to control what YouTube allows and doesn't allow. So we have to work within their algorithm because they're organized. They have the means of production over media, and particularly internet media, and we do not. And we can just do this over and over again, depending on which field you want to look at. So organizing from the perspective of oppressed people, from the perspective of Black African people, is about building that collective power to get to a point where you can govern those things that govern your day-to-day life, right? So we're going to look at an article that was written by Kamal Franklin. It was I keep saying article, but it was a speech that he gave at I believe it was at the first BAP convening. I know we just got back from the last one last month, but the first BAP convening 2 years ago, because I remember watching this because I wasn't able to attend. Not going to read through it all because, it's not a long piece, but just for the sake of time. So it's called, what does it mean to be a radical Black organizer today? And you remember him saying he purposely made it provocative, and he comes up with 6 different points to kind of clarify the difference between an organizer and even an activist. So number one, defining a radical revolutionary Black organizer, a person who is a part of an organization that seeks the support of building organizations, institutions, or collectives, primarily of poor and working class Black people, to change the material conditions of those people. An organizer must work together with those people to gain power, and he defines power as the ability to control and direct phenomena for the purpose of working class Black radical struggle. That's pulled generally from Huey P. Newton. And resources, land, property, money, people, for the continued fight against capitalism, white supremacist domination. We must be fighting to bring ownership to means of production and political apparatus that controls said production under the control of poor working class Black people. So that's why I was saying you have to actually get control over your material conditions, over the things that govern your day-to-day life. You're not doing that, it's not really organizing. So organizers must have a radical ideology that guides their work. I'm not going to read this entire part, but an organizer must not be swayed by propagandized ideas of integration, equality, equity, Black capitalism, wealth accumulation, etc. An organizer must understand the nature of capitalism and capital accumulation. Ultimately, your ideology must be sound enough to recognize that election victories, grant accumulation, property ownership, policy victories, etc., do not translate into radical change. In fact, depending on how a quote unquote victory is achieved in these areas, they may actually hurt radical change. The organizer must understand unless the means of production are transferred under the control of poor working class Black people and white supremacy can't harm Black people, then we have not won. We may have some individual battles, but that's not the same as being part of transforming society. Number 3, organizers must organize. Organizers' primary purpose is to swell the organization's ranks, move people to do organizing work, and build together on ideological work. This can be done through campaign work, meetings, service work, mutual aid, canvassing, conversations, etc. Organizers must be prepared to enter discussions with individuals to promote the need for radical organizing to change the material conditions. Number 4, an organizer must hold the collective together. The role of an organizer is not to win every argument. It is not to debate every topic of ideological clarity. It is not to correct every moment, every inconsistency. I have to remind myself of this sometimes. In other words, an organizer must learn to read the room and understand when it's appropriate to reach a consensus, to win an argument, or to lose one, and try to another time. The organizer must understand the protracted nature of the struggle and how to win people over ideological and political positions over time. The organizer must expect disagreement and must look for ways to bring people to a new understanding without losing people whenever possible. So if you are an asshole and a jerk, you're probably not going to be a good organizer. Like Rasul said to me, you know, two things: like, do what you say you're going to do and don't be an asshole. You do those things, you'll get a lot more work done. but you're
Plus,
always
you're
in
gonna
the
have to. Plus, you're gonna have to purpose in your mind, like, do you want to be right, or do you want to organize toward liberation? Like,
yeah.
what is more important to you in this point in time? And I'm glad he mentioned this. Not to win every argument.
Yeah.
Everything's not a debate. Is for ideological clarity.
Yeah, and it does, and it's
What,
not. It doesn't mean you don't argue or you don't challenge positions. You have to do that, but
yeah,
you do that with
yes.
the intention of arriving at a point of unity, if possible, not just to win for the sake of winning. So even how you approach your argument is important because you want to keep people together. You're not trying to separate the room and split people up. You know, so if you're doing that, you're not the greatest. You're not doing well. Number 5, an organizer must raise the level of resistance. Through words and deeds, the organizer must help bring people to action and help take away people's fear of the state and its tactics. Organizers must challenge authority without being reckless with the people around them. Right. So you think about the Pendleton 2 and how when you hear them talk, they had a sense of responsibility when they took those hostages. They didn't just go and kill all of them. It wasn't because they had some love for the police. It was understanding that we have men's lives in our hands, and if we wild out, we've seen Attica, we've seen these situations. They can come in here and slaughter all of us. But they also, at the same time, even though they had that care, they also inspired those men to take over the prison, to be organized in that moment, to come up with demands and such, because their courage got other people to go along with them. So like as I was saying, you don't have to be reckless, but you do have to find a way to move people beyond fear and and discouragement, which is something that I would say is something way more than that is an issue that is challenging organizing beyond just repression. Because I think another thing that people become so locked in on when they say it's easier to organize than Democrats, they're mainly just talking about repression, like Trump's going to do all these horrible things that the Democrats won't do, and even though that doesn't even always bear out. But I'm just saying, like, people are worried about repression, but repression is important to deal with. But I'm saying a lot of times, like, you can deal with people, you deal with apathy in organizing, where it's like you go to people and they don't want to do the thing, even if they agree with you. Like I've learned this with Pendleton too. They be like, "Man, that's terrible. I hope them brothers get out," but they're not gonna do more than sign a petition. That's just not where they at. So you have to figure out, how do I move people beyond just signing petitions, even though we need the petitions? How can we get more people activated beyond just petitions? That's a bigger challenge than just worried about repression, because before we even meet repression, we have to get enough people to care where the state would even feel the need to repress us in the first place. Like that's just like if ain't nobody even like organizing any real way, the state's not even dealing with you, because most things, I think Felicia said this in our last month, most things the state just does through process, like just the day-to-day ways of things, we get knocked off the board. So to even get beyond the day-to-day apathy to a point where the state even sees you as enough of a force to deploy resources against, to where repression comes in, you still got to get people to that point. Often, so when organizing, the challenge isn't just, oh, what if the FBI is gonna kill me? It's like, well, does the FBI even care about you, nigga? Like, are you even doing anything that the FBI would even be concerned about? No. So shut up. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just
Oh, so crazy.
Oh, they gonna be on my phone. It's like,
oh, you're saying, man, again, leave it to Too Black to drop them gems, because you said a whole lot. You said a whole lot right there, because people are worried about the repression of a Trump presidency, but then also there's a faction of people who feel like the biggest response to this so-called fascism that they're claiming is to not organize at all. You know,
Yep.
And if you guys know, the wink and the nod, you guys know what we're talking about.
Yeah, you're
You
gonna
know,
sit on a
so
building and watch the world burn and drink and
sit on
eat
the building and watch the
and
world,
eat ice cream.
and drink your Starbucks, and drink your
Yeah.
Starbucks, and you know it's so much he said right there because you know ultimately the goal is to get free. You know that was the goal of Balagoon and Naeem was to get free. The goal of a radical organizer or organizer in general is to get free. And it's not about the ego, it's not about trying to win every argument. It's about how can I utilize this person right here in front of me with first of all, how can I mobilize them, inspire them to want to act, and then keep their attention, and then wanting them to know more and also do more. It's about sometimes about I hate to use this cliche, but meeting people where they're at, but also at the same time pushing them further. You got to be able to push them further, and that should be our goal as radicals, as revolutionaries. There's another thing that you mentioned, you know, the whole idea of it's easier to organize under a democratic administration. You know, people, if it was easier, you would have won. But then if you said fascism is coming, the biggest idea that you have to confront fascism is just, oh, let it come. Just relax.
I'm gonna go
you know?
rest. Yeah,
But at the same time,
I'm minding my
the same group of
business.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the same group of people that will claim that Asada taught them. What does she
Yeah,
teach you?
yeah, okay.
It's all through. Okay, it's just
it's just that's what I'm saying. But
Yeah.
again, I don't think that's why we were talking about it as a philosophy. Part of the philosophy is that this isn't really about doing work. This is about always finding a reason not to do things. Talking about the lesser evil philosophy. So lesser evilism as a philosophy has upsides for folks that don't want to do work because you can always argue everything comes down to the election. And you can always argue you don't have to take any real risk because you're just trying to hold on to something that you don't want to lose or whatever. And then when it's attacked, you can say, well, this doesn't work, so I'm gonna be out and I'm not gonna do anything and I'm gonna go rest. Because it's like these people, these are part of the philosophy is also not really believing the analysis that you tout, this radical analysis that white supremacy is coming in fascism because
And
it's
then
really you don't really if you really believe that then the last thing you would want to do is take a nap or sit on the side of a building. I mean that's just what it is. So that's last one. I do want to get through this. Said an organizer must not give in to liberal dogma. Liberal dogma has taken over radical organizing, has purposely limited our vision and mission of what we should be attempting to accomplish. It has turned us inward and opposed to fighting the material gains, leaving us satisfied with the rhetoric of self-appreciation as nothing around us changes for better. This is exactly what we were talking about. So then he names some here are some ultra liberal talking points. Challenge: don't be ultra locals. People be like, if you're not from this hood, you can't organize here. It says organize, understand the capital is transnational and it must be a strategy to defeat it. It's not about just one neighborhood. Don't believe that don't believe there are no leaders. So you've heard this, unfortunately, Black Lives Matter help push, it's not the first time, but help push this idea of a leaderless movement, and they try to correct it with leader-full movement. And we don't need charismatic leaders. But then you have more people stealing and more people grifting than you did under charismatic leaders. Because at least if the pork chop minister stole all the money, we know Pastor Pork Chop stole the money because he put his name on it. If you act like it's no leaders and we're all just moving, then when you steal the money, it's like, well, I was never really over it. It's we talked about this, the tyranny of structurelessness. Read that essay. Politics, not representation, should lead. Right. So it shouldn't just be led by the representation of who you are. We get it. We know about black faces and high spaces. And he also said there are no born organizers. He said organizing is a skill with intuitive aspects to it. Having the gifts to organize does not in and of themselves make you one. Without ideology, study, practice, and humility, you can just as fast turn into a charlatan, an egomaniac, and a grifter. We have seen plenty of those in the last decade. And that's the end of the piece.
Ooh, there's a
So yeah, I mean, he snapped on that one. Organizing is organizing is hard work. It's not something that people who do it should glorify and hold over other people's heads and act like they're Jedi Knights and the rest of us are just minions. That's not, it's not, that's not the point, because the point is to bring people in. But it is important to emphasize just that organizing is necessary, because you are up against an organized enemy. You can't beat it by your own individual whatever. Like you have to join in with others, even when you don't necessarily like them and personally or whatever. You have to join in with others. That's just what's required, and things aren't going to get better if we don't do that. And Kamal lays out some of the, as well as Kwame Ture and others, lays out some of the mechanisms and, I would say in some cases requirements for doing that. So moving into the history section, since we have, I think, clarified some organizing things, debunked a few myths amongst this concept of organizing. So the question is, historically, is there a baseline or a basis for this case of it's easier to organize than the Democrats? Like, does this really bear out in history? And this is, I admit it, it's hard to track because you have to look at all these different metrics and they're all imperfect. But I think we can get some sense of a picture of how that works out historically. So we pick some different markers, and what we do is we're working from Roosevelt forward, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I believe, who was the 32nd president, and forward. So because before that, Black people voting Democrat was not a thing, and by like as a mass, it was kind of split. And even when you look through Roosevelt's terms, and I think he was in office for 12 years, the Black vote gradually climbed. You have to also remember the South couldn't even vote. And part of the New Deal coalition was this understanding that we're going to vote because the Democrats had a major majority, so we're going to pass all these New Deal programs. But part of the wink and nod was like, we're going to allow Jim Crow to continue to get the vote of the politicians from the South. So they'll vote for our social welfare. A lot of it won't apply to Black people in the South, particularly domestic workers and sharecroppers. And that was the kind of wink and nod between that so-called coalition and labor and such. And that's how they were able to get, the New Deal. I don't want to get too deep into that, but that's how you get Social Security and unemployment insurance and so on and so forth. The 40-day work week, collective bargaining, so on and so forth. And even then, those were compromises to much more radical organizing. So even then, so we're going to work from Franklin Roosevelt to today, and we're not really going to walk through this linearly. So we're going to jump around in history a little bit just to prepare people for that. But we just want to think about the different markers that show it's just not as cut and clean as organizing being easier under Democrats, or at least the conditions for organizing being more prominent under Democrats. So even if people weren't organizing, things that would lead to better conditions are not always that. All right. So we looked at a lot of different things. We looked at organizational involvement, and admittedly, this is all incomplete. So there's going to be other points of reference that we might be missing, and I'm all down for people pointing that out because this is not a full synthesis of it all. But so the NAACP, for instance, regardless how you feel about the org, their peak membership, according to them, on their own website was 600,000 people in 1946. And that was under a Democratic president, Harry Truman, actually. But at that time, yes, they had their peak involvement, but this is also at a time where, Black people can't vote. Black people are experiencing Jim Crow, right? Black people are discriminated against.
Jim Crow was a thing.
Yeah, it was a thing, So, but then you contrast that. Yeah, then you contrast that with, let's jump later in history. Again, we're going to jump around. The Black Panther Party, their membership peaked in 1970 under a Republican administration. That's Richard Nixon. They had the peak of 68 cities and offices in 68 cities, and that's when they had thousands of members. You look at historically, part of the, I believe, I remember Bruce Dixon for Black Agenda Report wrote about this. Part of the decline in Black Panther Party membership was due to when the draft got ended, because a lot of their a lot of the attention came to them because people were protesting in Vietnam. When the draft was ended, which I believe was in 72, don't quote me on that. When the draft got ended, their membership tended to drop off. Now there were other, as we know, internal issues, and there was also just the fucking COINTELPRO program. So I'm not saying, but part of it was also just membership dropped, because they thought the issues to some extent had been resolved. But look at the Communist Party of the United States, CPUSA. They peaked in the late 40s, 1947, 75,000 members in 1947, and had much of bigger reach beyond their membership. At the same time, as we're going to get to later, it was the Truman administration and him giving a kind of olive branch to McCarthy and them, Joseph McCarthy, that leads to the repression of communists. And even by then, Truman had started doing his loyalty oaths by 1947, where people in the government had to state that they weren't communists, etc. So again, this is
or
okay,
have their lives. They had to prove that they weren't communists or have their lives upended.
Exactly.
And then also, just to go back to the military draft, last call draft was 72, but it ended in 73.
Okay. That's why I said don't quote me on that. Thank you.
It's all good.
So again, we're not looking at every organization historically. So looking at Black Lives Matter, so y'all can get something more contemporary, because y'all like, this is a long time ago, all these works. I'm looking at Black Lives Matter.
But yeah, they do that a lot. Yeah.
I mean, again, easier to organize, but in 2020, everybody likes to throw 2020 out, but that was when Trump was in office. And it's estimated that somewhere from 15 to 26 million people participated in protests. That is considered the largest participation, I believe, in history, if not one of the largest in history. Now, that is not coming back to mobilizing and organizing. That was a lot of mobilizing, but I'm just saying, if it's easier to get that many, if it was about Democrats to get that many people on the streets, the most people potentially ever that came out for Black people was in 2020 when Trump was in office. Now, there are a lot of factors to that. That's why we're saying it's not a matter of Republicans make it easier or Democrats, because there was COVID, niggas ain't had shit to do. There was all the lockdowns, there was less distractions because a lot of the entertainment stuff was on pause, right?
Yes.
So there's a lot of factors that lead to that. But I'm just saying, thinking about it, it doesn't demonstrate that it's easier to organize under Democrats. And really, there was a lot of opportunity, as we talked about earlier, to organize here. And a lot of that energy went to grifters and, buying black and all kinds of stuff that didn't even lead to anything that put us in a position 4 years later where now we have to deal with this man again, and with more fervor behind him. I'm talking about Trump.
Yeah, and then like Kwame Ture said, it just led to just a bunch of reformist bullshit.
Yeah,
and it wasn't anything substantial whatsoever. Yeah, and again, underneath the Trump presidency. But go ahead.
Yeah, it was a missed moment, I would say, honestly. Doesn't mean it wasn't good work being done, but it didn't hit, So I'm gonna speed through a few other things again. We have a fairly long list, even though we didn't hit everything. But again, protests and riots, however, or let's say uprisings, as I like to call them, in 1967, there were 150 what the media would call race riots. 150 in 1 year. Right. That was under a Democratic president, Johnson, who had lost the country at that point, so much so that he didn't want to run for re-election in 68.
Nope.
And seeing a major blowback to the so-called civil rights bills that he had passed just a few years prior, and was actually confused for whatever reason as to why everybody was so mad. because the so-called progress that the people were talking about had definitely not made it to the North. Now,
Yeah.
1972, and this is shout out to Orisami Burton that brought this to my attention in his book Tip of the Spear, saw the most prison revolts. Right, so that was under a Republican administration. That was a year after Attica. It was one study said 48 prison revolts erupted in 1972. That was the most in a single year up to that point, because people were taking folks off the streets and put them in prisons, the revolutionaries, and put them in prisons. And now they just start organizing inside the prison. And the people who got put in prison under the Democratic president organized in prison under the Republican president. It's just not that simple. So, the world has people can't fit in these kind of boxes. Looking at other things like union density, for instance, so you can say typically it's believed, and I think there is some truth to this, that under Republicans, they're definitely less pro-union than Democrats, but even a lot of Democrats have moved to be very anti-union, or they crush workers as well, because again, we're still talking about capitalists here. So you look at peak union density, and the union density, for those who don't know, that just means what percentage of workers were in unions. That's all that means. Peak union density for all workers, not using race, was actually in 1954 under a Republican president, on 34%, about 35% under Eisenhower, 1954. Peak union density for black workers, was actually in 1983, almost 31.7%. That was under Reagan, who was considered a union killer, and he was. It's not a myth. So it just shows you that, and the best times that maybe black workers were enjoying the fruits of their labor didn't necessarily it wasn't perfectly under a Democrat. And then, as another stat we have here, black union workers on average earn about 16% higher wages than non-union black workers. So that's a house versus an apartment. This difference, that's a new car versus a raggedy car. That's your kid going to college versus not. That's a major difference. That's 16%. So again, we can move through it. I don't want to go through all of this because we'll be here forever. But looking at social movements, we've covered a lot of this on this show, so I'm not really gonna get deep into this. But civil rights movement, there's debates on when it starts, but if we take the kind of mainstream number, 1955, again under a Republican, so that's where it started, and then it goes into the 60s under a Democrat. So again, if it's easy to organize, why didn't it start a Democrat? Black Power movement, same thing. You take when Malcolm X is killed, assassinated. You take Kwame Ture down in Mississippi, claiming Black Power, and was it 65, 66, and you expand it into the 70s, expands both administrations. We talked about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in the last episode, literally was crushed by the Democrats. Republicans had nothing to do with that, actually. so
yeah.
Now that was a lot of the crackers that were in Mississippi at the time that were Democrats eventually become Republicans. That's the whole Southern strategy, et cetera, that happens under Nixon, because they were mad about the Democrats being giving more love to black folks than they had, And then there's anti-apartheid movement that you see. I do want to say, I know I see what I have in my notes, but the anti-apartheid movement, obviously, the major work of the anti-apartheid movement happened in South Africa. I do want to say that, not here or in Europe, but there were some shifts during Reagan, where Reagan didn't want to do nothing about South Africa, and due to some of the divestment shifts, you did see companies like Chase and Pepsi and General Electric started to end activity in South Africa under a Republican administration that was very favorable to Israel. right? To the point, and that even Congress passed sanctions against Israel. I said Israel.
South Africa. South Africa.
Same difference.
But no, that's facts though. That's
Yeah,
facts. It's apartheid is apartheid.
yeah. So it's like, again, I won't get too deep into it, but in 1986, Congress passed a sanctions bill against South Africa. Reagan tried to veto it, but there was enough strength where they actually had a super majority and they were able to overdo that. Now that is electoral politics, but again, we're not saying don't do electoral politics. We're just saying don't do it based solely on of affiliation with party and a lesser evilism, philosophy. Um, Occupy Wall Street, just using another social movement. This is more of a repressive story because basically the U.S. Department of Homeland Security coordinated with police departments in 2011, 2012, and also coordinated with the White House. And they told police about different tactics and when to use them. And they shut down Occupy Wall Street. And that was a coordinated federal effort. And then guess what? Trump uses the same strategy in 2020 when he was beefing with people out in Portland, right? That was how he used the same strategy in 2020. They actually called it the Occupy strategy. That's what Bill Barr said, right? So he used a Obama pretext to shut down Occupy Wall Street. So again, like explain, make it make sense.
I mean, Angela Davis did say not a victory in relation to what he actually accomplished during his presidency, Thank you for that caveat.
And then
Davis,
even I can't remember the name of the bill because I didn't write this in the notes, but or it wasn't a bill, it was like a executive order or something. But Trump used the pretext for his Muslim ban. Trump used the pretext that the Obama administration had set because they had labeled certain countries dangerous and put them under travel advisories anyway. And basically was banning folks from Muslim countries. They just didn't call it a Muslim ban. Trump used that as a pretext to create what we remember as the Muslim ban.
Black, it almost seems like it doesn't matter who's president. It seems like repression and oppression will still continue.
Yeah. I mean, who would have thought? Yeah.
Who would have thunk it?
Yeah. So speaking of repression, now this list is very long, so we're gonna have to skip through a lot of this. But police budgets continue to go up.
Yes.
No matter who's in office. And we've done a lot of episodes on police budgets, so I refer y'all to those. The Crack Baby episode is probably the best one in terms of not just police budgets, but just seeing how the state transformed. But there are others. There's We Need the Police Myth.
We have touched on that a lot.
Yeah, we touched on that a lot.
Even the New Bones abolition episode where we talk about Erica Garner even talked about ballooning of police budgets and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground with this. My fault. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead, man.
No, yeah, it's cool. So this is from Washington Post piece, I believe. In 1960, about $2 billion was spent by state and local governments on police. It's also like police are very localized or state and local thing. They're not necessarily the federal level is not the highest in the police. And there was about 1,887 crimes per 100,000 Americans, including 161 violent crimes. By 1980, spending had increased to 14.6 billion. So in 20 years, it went from 2 billion to 14.6, and crimes had soared, right? But over the next 2 decades, crime actually fell, but spending spiked to more than 67 billion. 18 years later, by 2018, the most recent year for full data available, this is at the time of this article, crimes have fallen further to 2,580 per capita, yet police spending continues to go up. It was a small dip in 2020, not because of really to defund the police, but just because of budget cuts and people moving money around because 2020, the economy shrunk. But beyond that, no. Police killings. Now we don't. The thing about the state doesn't actually do a good job of tracking police killings. So I'm just going to
You
deal with the
think?
last. That's one. To be
Yeah.
fair, this is one of the actual accomplishments of Black Lives Matter. Is it did create databases where police killings were tracked better than they were prior, because there was really not a
So they
consistent database.
so they can track our repression.
Yeah,
Great job. Great
our
job.
deaths, right?
Track our
So
deaths.
in 2021, this is due since 2020. In 2021, police killed about 1,200 people. 292 of those folks were black. In 2022, police killed about 1,266 people. 308 of those people were black. In 2023, police killed 1,353 people. 321 of those people were black. This year, I don't know where it's going to end. It's almost over. It looks like it's actually went down slightly for the first time in 3 years, but I don't. But we'll see by the end of the year. So that was all under Biden.
Yes.
But
Yep, all under Biden. Again, tell us, how is it easier to organize underneath the Democratic administration?
And again, if it is easier to organize, people aren't doing it.
No.
Right. So
Mhm.
like not on an effective enough level. So if it is easier to organize, fine. I guess that matters in the ether, but people are not doing that. So if because you should be able to bring police killings down. Right.
Exactly.
And again, I don't like to distinguish between armed and unarmed. Just bring it down, period. So people are not doing that. Therefore, it's not working. Now, again, to be fair, we pick these things. So I do want to say there are things that have improved and haven't. I'm not saying everything has only gotten worse. You know, but it's some of that is due. The question is how much is that is just due to organizing versus that's maybe just part of the overall agenda of the state, and that they're willing to improve conditions for this or that. And a lot of things have gotten worse. One of the biggest episodes of repression in history is the Red Scare, and there's multiple Red Scares. We're going to deal with what's called basically the second Red Scare after World War II. I'm definitely not going through all these bills. I would say read Dr. CBS's book, Black Scare, Red Scare, because a lot of these I learned or was refreshed about through her book. But just to name a few, this is actually a quote from her book. 3 Southern states maintain old insurrection and sedition laws like that of Evangeline Herndon, which only applied to radical groups. In addition, this is I think by 1939. In addition, 21 states required loyalty oaths for teachers, and 4 states had laws barring from the ballot parties or candidates that advocated for the overthrow of the government by force or violence, or that carried on a program of sedition or treason, in other words, communist socialists. In typical fashion, Texas took those laws to the extreme by imposing the death penalty by communists. Sheesh. All told, anti-radical legislation of some kind was found in 42 states. Of these criminal anti-syndicalism laws, largely to eradicate the IWW, the International Working.
All right. So the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, among practices prohibited by the Taft-Hartley Act are jurisdictional strikes, wildcat strikes, solidarity or political strikes, secondary boycotts, and mass picketing, closed shops, monetary donations by unions to federal political campaigns. The amendment also allowed states to enact right-to-work laws banning union shops. Fun fact, Indiana is a right-to-work state as well.
Yep.
And in 1947,
1947,
Harry S. Truman was president in 1947.
Yeah. The McCarran, I'm going to just speed through these for the sake of time. McCarran Act 1950, Smith Act 1940, the Executive Order 9835 by Truman. All of these in some way, shape, or form. It's funny, the McCarran Act, quick one, that it actually required communist organizations to register with the federal government. It was Nixon that actually repeals that law. Like just so You know, just funny little, that was just like doing the
Some
history,
people,
just find little funny details. Again, it's not a celebration of Nixon. It's just funny
nah.
that this is not as evened out as people like to make it seem. The Smith Act, I think that's the one that they got Du Bois on for trying to overthrow the government. You have to register as a foreign agent. And the executive order, that was the one we talked about earlier, where Truman basically instituted the loyalty oaths. And what's funny about that is actually the his attorneys general list of subversive organizations was what Joseph McCarthy used as a pretext to go at everybody. Was Truman's thing. And it's funny, Truman tried to actually veto a lot of these bills that we just named, but it's like you wanted people to help set this in motion. So we come to the present because again, people be like, oh, it's 1940, whatever, and we have Cop City.
Well,
And we don't have as much. We're running short on time, so again, we have the Georgia hit 42 Cop City activists with so-called domestic terrorism. Funny enough, that was based on a law that was changed after Dylan Roof killed the 9 black folks in Charleston, and they expanded domestic terrorism to mean certain types of property damage. So when people when folks get killed in a black church, that becomes a reason to then you can use that to charge people protesting the building of a mega police center, training center with domestic terrorism. That was in March of 2023. The next, I think, by September of that year, there was 61 people were hit with the RICO, racketeer influence corrupt organizations. We all know about RICO. Over ongoing efforts to halt construction, indicted activists, including a protest observer, faced STIP penalties. Now these charges were dropped, and even bail funds got caught up in this for money laundering. Funny enough. This was brought by the state of Georgia, which is a Republican state, but they worked with the Democratic city, who's the one that proposed Cop City in the first place. Right. So,
the
and
Black
a black
Mecca,
mayor.
right?
Yeah, Black Mecca, all that. So then when activists take the so-called nonviolent route and they gathered 116,000 signatures, the city blocked it. They said they wouldn't accept them. It wasn't in by the due date, whatever. All right, so that's what happened there. I hope everybody's aware of what Cop City is. If not, get up on that $90 million center to train police. And that actually, it also resulted in the assassination of Tortuga.
Yeah, rest in peace.
So prisons, again, could go all day, man. Prisons, again, another topic we've covered a lot on the show, so I won't get into that. But prisons start to expand actually within the states in the late 70s. And it's also important now, people talk about Reagan, but like Jimmy Carter and the Trilateral Commission that he was working with, they had a very that was the first kind of wave in the United States of like explicit neoliberalism before Reagan. Reagan kind of just consolidates it. The war on drugs had started in 68 under Nixon, but it is reignited in 1982 under Reagan, which gives more money for prison expansion and police expansion. But as we've noted in other episodes, it was actually Biden that pushed Reagan, because Reagan was us, the states' rights person. He didn't want to do it. This shit. Biden pushed Reagan because Biden wanted to prove that Democrats were harsher on crime than the Republicans. Funny enough, coming back to Truman, who was in office during that second Red Scare, if you read up on it, he wanted to push the loyalty oaths because he wanted to prove that Democrats were not soft on communism and the Soviet Union. So there's always some boogeyman that we got to be hard on. That's the American way, of course. We are aware of the Uru 3 that got off on the worst charge, but they were raided and charged with Yeah, they were raided and charged. They were indicted by the U.S. government on bogus charges of being agents of a foreign government or Russian agents for exercising their right to free speech to advocate for the liberation of African people. So because they like had, and there was this Russian agent that tried to get in contact with them or something like that. Russian agent. There was a guy who was Russian, and and they, but they say they're close to the Kremlin or whatever, right? So, but they were the main charge was dropped, but they still got hit with another one. And then the jury found the Euro 3 not guilty of being Russian agents because they were actually charged with being Russian agents, and all they did was like basically criticize the Ukraine war. The prosecutors deliberately misled and confused the jury into returning an inconsistent verdict while convicting them on the bogus. They were convicted on conspiracy charges, which are very vague and don't make sense. Again, read Dr. CBS's work to get more details on that. So yeah, there is so much. I mean, there's so much we haven't touched on COINTELPRO, which starts technically in 1956 as a program to track communists, and then it is flipped into something to particularly track the black radicals and the revolutionaries. But it was originally wasn't for that. So from 56 to 71, COINTELPRO counterintelligence program. J. Edgar Hoover, who there's a joke within this kind of scholarship that McCarthyism should really be called Hooverism, because Hoover was the most anti-communist motherfucker you ever meet, and he expands from like going all the way back to like Garvey and getting him kicked out all the way into this, like he expands all these administrations, and there's a very consistent force within the FBI. McCarthy lasted very little. I don't even think people should call things McCarthyism because McCarthy was not even nearly the worst one. We think about assassinations. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, J. Edgar Hoover has a whole career of doing shit. Like you say, expands different administrations the same way. Like here, Henry Kissinger expands different administrations. These figures have been around for a very long time, and they're complicit in a lot of ugly shit that happens to radicals, and especially happens to black people and people overseas. So just again, something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And then I'm gonna just kind of cut the rest of this because I think people get the point. I mean, just to give y'all a sense of what else we had, because it wasn't done. We had like poverty rates, we had assassinations, we had literacy rates, we had upward mobility and affirmative action, which was interesting learning about that. I will speak briefly on that. Affirmative action, actually, the first time you hear the term affirmative action is under Kennedy, then it gets kind of just gradually gets pushed. Then Johnson pushes it. Affirmative action didn't originally mean like hiring more people. It was originally just like, can the government stop discriminating? And then it became like, or try to stop discriminating. Then Johnson was like, stop discriminating. And then under Nixon, it was like, okay, now you got to hire people, right? Like, and so affirmative action actually peaks. It peaks under Nixon and creates a larger black middle class. Again, a Republican. There's an article called The Last Liberal President. It's about Nixon. And they call him the last liberal president because he still embraced a lot of New Deal type of policies, even though he's a Republican. I mean, again, I'm not lifting up Nixon. It's just an interesting contradiction of the United States. So
was he also the same one that said black? He said black power is through black capitalism.
Yeah,
you want to say when he said that. So
and that was part of why he pushed it, was because it was a way to fight back against black power as an anti-capitalist formation. So yeah, I mean, it's just like again, like we said at the very beginning, this isn't dictated by administrations. If the organizing is strong, you'll be surprised what concessions you can get under either party. But if the organizing is weak, you're not likely to get concessions under anybody. So if you just continue to just do the lesser evil bullshit, you're not winning that battle no how. you know. So last point, I know that was a long section, but it was important to walk through that history. Last point, I saw this comment, and I actually made this name of a section in our pre-production. Someone said, "What are easier organizing conditions?" Right. So we've clearly, I think, demonstrated that this is not historically, this doesn't really hold up, doesn't hold up today. But it doesn't mean that, as we talked about in that pre-production episode, Trump isn't a real threat or it's just like shrugs. No. And admittedly, I don't have like a firm one answer for this question, like what are easier organizing conditions? Because I think you would have to say those conditions have to be conditions that get you towards your goal. But as Marx once stated, I'm kind of paraphrasing, we don't get to pick the world that we want to live in. We don't get to pick the world that we have to deal with the material conditions that are in front of us. So it's a good question of what is an easy organizing condition, but I think it's a matter of, how do you create, like Angela Davis was talking about, creating openings. The point is about creating openings through the organizing itself, not just by electing someone. So like we use the Pendleton 2 example. If we, when we pull that off, if we've done it properly through our organizing, that lets people know that gives people some confidence to get more engaged. That's what we've been able to do thus far with the campaign. Max Rameau, who's the lead organizer of Black Alliance for Peace, talks about, like, his question isn't even always if you win your campaign. It's a question of how many more people have you activated, how many people have gotten involved, how many more people have you inspired to want to do work, right?
Yes.
Because you need a mass base. If we get them out of prison, that's important, but it's also important to see how many more people have we activated since the beginning of the campaign that are going to go on to do other organizing work, right? So the conditions are, you're creating openings, yes, but you want to create those openings not just by electing a loser, like we had at the beginning of our show, who's drunk and decrepit, but but like, how do you
I love the shots.
but how do you create those openings, and in terms of electoralism, is it third parties? You've heard this term reformist reforms, not a big fan of it, but it's basically like reforms that there's reformist reforms and there's non-reformist reforms, as in like form, like, again, I'm not a big fan of this, but the case they're making is like they'll always say defund the police is a non-reformist reform because it takes power away from the police. So, and I think theoretically that holds up, even though I don't know if I always like how it played out. So if your reforms are not inherently bad in every case scenario, like if you can do things that weaken the state and bring more power to the people, then those are, I think, generally better reforms. So that's why I don't tell people to not engage in electoral politics at all. If there's like a question of, giving women abortion in Indiana, then we should vote for it. If you can legalize weed, you should vote for it. If you can get rid of the right to work law, and it was on an amendment in Indiana, you should vote for it.
Yes.
And just organizing for amendments in general are good. I mean, it's hard to get an amendment in Indiana because you need, like, I think, congressional approval. So it's hard to get one. You can't just have signatures. But like, there are things, if you think they empower the people more to do their work, then I'm not saying don't vote for those things. But even that is tactically, you usually have to organize to get those things on a ballot or to get those things as an issue, right? It's not going to just show up on a ballot, right? People had to go collect signatures to even get some of these like pro-abortion amendments on the ballot. People had to go do that work to then give it for people to vote on it. That doesn't just show up on your ballot. And then thinking about some of the stuff to come to kind of close it out, there's the this act that just passed the House, HR 9495. It's called the Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act. And basically it gives the Treasury Secretary the power to label a nonprofit as a terrorist supporting organization without really any evidence.
Yep.
It hasn't passed the Senate or anything, but imagine giving that to Trump. So we also need to be considering that maybe this nonprofit model is on its last legs. Because if they can just start labeling folks as terrorists, and we just went over the not Red Scare shit, then we're already in that kind of phase. But like, so we have to also have to consider that the nonprofit model, and I don't have all the answers for this, may not be the only way to do work. We might have to go back to member dues, right? I mean, if people can get fucking, you know, 3-4 grand a month, or I mean, as a little podcast, and then you have some podcasts, I ain't gonna name who, getting $50,000-$60,000 a month, you know, through Patreon, then it's not impossible to have organizations follow a similar, like do that themselves. And maybe some of these podcasts don't need 40,000 a month when their organizations getting labeled as terrorists. You know, because you can lose your nonprofit status under that law. And then you can't take any more money. And then they can freeze your assets and all that kind of shit. So, you know, people talk about this as free speech. I actually think about this as a sanction. And I think it's much better if we think about it as a sanction, because it's not just free speech. It's a means of cutting you off from resources, not just cutting off your ability to speak your mind. Right. And that's what sanctions do. They cut countries off from resources. They, you know, you freeze Russia's account in the SWIFT thing, and take all their assets. You won't allow Cuba to import basic things for medicine. You know, lead to starvation and migration, and those are sanctions. So if you start hitting organizations with terrorist labels, what you do to them is you effectively put them out of business and that's not just a free speech issue. Those are sanctions. You know,
that's a great way to look at it. I never would have thought about that, because, like you said, I mean, a sanction, you're threatened a penalty for disobeying some law, you know, and the fact that they can so easily just deplatform you just because of your views and your work, it just so happens to not coincide with the empire. I mean, if you think about what happened to African Stream, you know, the way they were deplatformed, they got rid of all the Google accounts, and the way it just makes it seem like they never like it never existed. It's a scary thought to think about, but this is what we're dealing with, right?
Based on nothing. Based on
nothing. Like, they completely made it up.
Russian conspiracy.
Russian bots. And then I mean, I was talking with Black, and it's just so interesting how, when that narrative is pushed, how the Black misleadership class picks up on it. Because I was talking, again, in the pre-recording episode, that you start to have certain figures like a Roland Martin who repeats these narratives. Like, there's these bots, they're from Russia, they're getting the influence from China, getting influence from Iran, so on and so forth. And it's just like, you know, just be conscious that no matter who's in office or what administration is in office, we should continue to organize. The organizing doesn't stop. It will change along the way. It'll have to evolve, like our tactics will have to evolve, strategies, but the organizing must continue.
Yeah, and if
don't get to sit this one out.
No, and if you're not involved in anything, again, this is a whole other episode, and I know some people disagree with what I'm about to say. I know we say join the organization. I don't disagree. I do think there has to be some smell test, as they say, on how you do that, because I don't think people can come back from every bad experience. So we do need organizations that are strong enough that when people join, they actually can get activated. I do think having some criteria for that is important. You know,
and I can speak, and I was going to say, I can speak from experience, and I believe probably Black can speak from experience, that joining the wrong type of organization and then trying to push said organization toward a radical end, especially that radical nature is not already baked into the structure of said organization, you're going to set yourself up for a lot of heartbreak and a lot of disappointment. I'm gonna
Yeah.
tell you that right now, because and it kind of ties back to the idea of whether it's easier to organize underneath a democratic administration. And the organization may have like liberal tendencies and everything. It doesn't make it
Yeah.
easier for you to go in there as a radical
Right.
to try and flip that and go toward stronger radical objectives. Believe
Yeah,
me,
like
they will
some
root you out real quick.
yeah, like especially those well-functioning machines. You
Mm-hmm.
can there are orgs that aren't that strong or they don't really know what they're doing that I think that I will those are the ones I say people should join. If it's not an actual radical org, join a
Mm-hmm.
weak organization that doesn't really that gets money but it doesn't have any sense of direction, doesn't have a hard line on things because they're not doing much. Join that, bring some people in, and you might be able to take that over and get resources. Joining something that's a well-functioning machine, like you join the NAACP, you might be able to do some shit on the local level, but eventually you're going to hit your head against the national, the national body, which is not going to play ball with anything that's not just Democratic parties. And
You're going
that's
to hit
just
a
how.
definite glass
Yeah,
ceiling.
yeah. Uh, and you can if they're not there to join, you form them. But again, I'm sympathetic to this because especially us growing up in fucking Muncie, Indiana, and being in Indiana in general, there's not a whole lot of these things happening around us. There's not even like fake revolutionary shit often happening, let alone anything serious. So I'm sympathetic to people who are looking for something to join and it's hard. They feel like they're the only ones. But again, you don't have to change the world on day one. So even if you join
Mm-hmm.
BAP and you're in a random city that ain't got no other BAP people, just being in contact with folks and learning some of those skills can give you the strength to ultimately maybe get to a city chapter or get to something like that, right? But you
Mm-hmm.
have to work your way in. Organizations aren't the end all be all. And organizations you can define that in very different ways. So they don't have to be a 501c3. You don't have to be loud about it. It can be a lot of different things, but you have to have some committed amount of people that, you know, that are willing to do work. So we'll probably deal more if I can get who I think I want to get on for part two. We'll deal more with this aspect of it, like getting deeper into organizing and kind of different types of organizing and stuff like that. But hopefully, been on here forever. Hopefully, this gives you a sense of, the people who are pushing this. Again, I don't like to pull the organizer card, like I'm an organizer or not, huh? But I do think it gets to a point where it's obvious. I'll just say it's obvious that some people are not doing anything beyond, activism or advocacy, and that's being nice. They're just talking about issues and they're hoping someone else will go do something about them. So it would be equivalent if we just told you about the Pendleton 2 and we moved on.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people doing that online. And there's a place for that. I'm not even totally shitting on it, but I'm saying a lot of people that criticize or a lot of people that bring these arguments up, picking your opponent and all of that, usually aren't doing much more than just talking about it. That's just what it is. Now, there are some orgs that believe this, even that, like I'm not saying the NDN organization, I believe they organize. I'm not going to take that from them. So there are organizers, radicals, whatever people want to call themselves that do that. But a lot of what people probably listen to this show and listen to podcasts or hearing are people who spend most of their time, at tangentially at best, maybe talking to radicals or talking to activists, talking to organizers in their interviews or whatever, but they're not doing any of that kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
But yet they tend to occupy a lot of the money, a lot of the time, a lot of the energy, but they're not really doing that kind of work. So I'll let y'all sit with that. Again, I'm not going at any one person, but I'm just saying consider that when you hear some of this stuff about voting come from people who don't organize anything. Or who used to formally do it, but have kind of moved on to just being more of a spokesperson at best, or
Yeah.
just someone who
A
talks
talking
about
head.
it. Yeah, but they don't really do it anymore. So,
Mm-hmm.
Organizers aren't some perfect thing that if someone says they're an organizer, it just means you wave the wand. No, but I'm just saying there is something to be said about actually like learning from it. You learn from it by doing it. That's just what it is. So that is all. We'll get to that on part 2. I don't even, because if people made it to the end, it's better to make this announcement at the beginning. But yeah, that is all. I think even though just 2 of us, we still definitely took up the time.
I mean, would you expect any less from us, for real though?
Yeah.
I mean, again, I guess to put a nice little cap on it, like Black said, there's nothing magical about organizing. It takes a lot of work. You're going to make mistakes along the way. You have to study. You have to be able to be out there on the ground, talk to people, touch people, and learn along the way. That's it. No matter who is in office, the work, the struggle has to continue, and that is it. No compromise, no retreat.
No compromise, no retreat. Peace out.
Peace.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck